There is a moment that stays with the community the way a scar stays on skin, not as pain exactly, but as a permanent alteration of the surface. The moment that settled itself into the memory of Harlan County's sheep farmers arrived on a Thursday morning in the third week of August, when the heat had been so unchanged and so complete for so long that people had stopped remarking on it and simply moved through it the way fish move through water, barely aware that they were submerged. The meeting was held in the feed barn belonging to the agricultural cooperative. The big sliding doors thrown open on both sides to let what passed for a breeze move through, and the smell of old alfalfa and mineral dust hung in the air like a presiding spirit. Perhaps 24 families had gathered on bales and lawn chairs and tailgates, and at the front of the room, near the whiteboard, someone had wheeled in from the county extension office, stood a man named Gerald Pruitt, Regional Acquisitions Director for a company called Consolidated Pasture Holdings, whose business card described him as a partner in agricultural futures. He was a careful dresser, Gerald Pruitt, a man who wore a belt that matched his boots in a county where nobody much cared about either, and he had a way of setting his clipboard down on a surface that suggested he was doing you a favor by staying in the room. He had numbers on his whiteboard. He had figures per acre and amortized losses and projected carrying costs and all the vocabulary of arithmetic used not to count things but to frighten them. And all those numbers, all that frightening, was aimed at a single point on the far side of the room where a woman named Clara Voss sat on a hay bale with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes steady as still water, saying nothing, waiting. The room was so quiet that when Pruitt uncapped his marker, it made a small pop that a child near the door turned to look at. Everyone in that barn knew that Clara Voss had the only thing in Harlan County that the drought had not touched, and Gerald Pruitt wanted it, and the families gathered in between them waited to learn what kind of woman she had turned out to be. Pruitt cleared his throat. He said her name with a particular careful warmth that was a tool rather than a feeling. Clara Voss did not look at the whiteboard. She already knew what the land knew, and the land had been keeping its own accounts since long before Gerald Pruitt earned his first business card. The true verdict, as everyone in that barn would eventually understand, had not been rendered this morning. It had been rendered 14 months ago in a muddy lot at the edge of a failing property, in the company of one lopsided donkey and a field of thin exhausted grass, by a woman who had learned, very slowly and at considerable cost, to listen to what she was looking at. She had arrived in April of the year before, the mud still showing on the county roads, the creek running, the hills green in that temporary hopeful way that April manages before summer makes a liar of it. She came in a borrowed pickup with a 2-horse trailer repurposed for household goods, and she was 33 years old alone, and in possession of a cashier's check that represented everything she had rescued from a decade of careful living and one careless marriage. She had trained as an agricultural technician, had spent 8 years advising other people's operations, had watched other people make decisions about animals and ground, and had spent those years forming opinions she was never invited to share. When the Demarest place became available at the county foreclosure auction, she had done her arithmetic 6 ways, and then done it a 7th, to be certain, and she had gone and spent all but $400 of what she had on 41 acres of overworked pasture, a leaking equipment shed, a farmhouse with a replaced roof, and original plumbing, and nothing, because the seller owed unpaid fees to the livestock transport company that had handled his dispersal sale, and the transport company had left 3 ewes and a ram behind as partial settlement of that debt. 4 sheep. Just the 4 of them, standing in a pen that was 2 fence repairs away from being no pen at all, looking at her arrival with the dignified indifference of animals that have outlasted one human failure already and are simply evaluating whether this new one looks any more promising. The county had opinions about Clara Voss's purchase before she had the title recorded. In a community of families who had been reading the same ground for 2 and 3 generations, a single woman, alone childless, with no evident husband or father or brother to provide the credibility that local custom still extended to men by default, who had spent real money on the most exhausted piece of ground in the valley, was a figure who invited a particular kind of gentle, communal condescension dressed up as concern. The woman at the county clerk's office was kind and specific about what the Demarest place had done to the Demarest. A pair of men at the co-op loading dock discussed her purchase in normal-speaking voices while she stood not 8 feet away waiting for her first delivery of mineral supplement. She heard the word stubborn used the way it is used about a stump that won't pull, admiring its solidity in the abstract while viewing it mainly as an inconvenience. She heard the word shame used the way it is used about a good horse run to ruin. She heard the phrase, "a woman alone," said the way a door closes, with an air of finality. What she did not hear was a word about the donkey. The donkey had not been part of the original auction. He had been living in a back pasture that the county assessor had noted only as adjacent outbuilding and fencing, and the neighbor to the east, a man named Harland Webb, who ran a beef operation that was smaller every year and louder about it every year in inverse proportion, had been using the back pasture on an informal and unrecorded basis. When Clara Voss walked the property boundaries in her first week, she found the donkey standing alone in that back lot, as though he had been waiting there for a decision to be made about him. He was, she would later calculate, approximately 15 years old, though the previous owner's records were incomplete on this point, as they were on most points. He stood about 11 hands. His spine had a visible sag in it that gave him the look of a sentence with too many words in the middle. One ear stood straight, and one ear listed slightly to the left as though it were listening for something the upright ear found too obvious to bother with. His color was the gray of old fence wood. He looked, in the plainest possible assessment, like a liability. He looked like the last chapter of something. Harland Webb, when she knocked on his door to discuss the back pasture arrangement, came out onto his porch and looked at her over his coffee mug with an expression she would come to know as the county's standard issue appraisal of her judgment, and he told her she was welcome to the donkey. That nobody had wanted him at the Demarest sale because nobody wanted the trouble, and that if she had any interest in sensible livestock decisions, she would shoot him and fence the back pasture for another 2 acres of grazing. He said this as a man says something to a child, slowly and with the patience of someone who expects to be disregarded. She did not shoot the donkey. In tut. She did not in the first weeks do much of anything with him except make sure he had water and the thin grass of the back lot, and whatever the mineral lick she ordered could contribute to the project of his continued existence. She was busy with the fence repairs, the leaking equipment shed, the plumbing situation, and the sheep, who required more management than 4 sheep had any right to require. Given that she had managed operations of 400 with less daily drama. She was also busy with her arithmetic, which she ran in the evenings on a yellow legal pad, and which arrived at conclusions that were honest rather than encouraging. She had the 4 sheep and a donkey that ate and produced nothing. She had 41 acres, perhaps 22 of them, in reasonable working condition. She had $400 in reserve. She had her skills, which were real, and she had her opinions, which were not yet wanted, and she had the work itself, which was relentless. It was in the 2nd month, on a morning when she had been awake since 4 dealing with a ewe, who turned out to be pregnant in a way that the dispersal sale documentation had not mentioned, that Clara Voss sat in the lot in the early light with her back against the fence post and arrived at the closest thing to despair she permitted herself. The lamb, when it came, was small and alive, and she felt the particular exhausted relief of a thing concluded. Well, and the ewe settled herself, and the lamb found what it needed, and Clara Voss sat there in the mud and the thin morning light counting what she had. 5 sheep, 1 donkey, 22 workable acres, fewer than $400. She was doing the arithmetic again, the way you press a bruise, not from pleasure, but from a need to know if it is still there. And the numbers were not moving in the direction she needed, and the mud was cold, and she was 34 years old and alone, and had spent everything she had on a hope that the county regarded as a joke. And then the donkey walked over. He walked over with the deliberate plodding gravity of an animal that has thought about this and found it reasonable, and he put his long gray nose against the top of her head with a pressure that was not quite a nudge and not quite a rest, but something in between, something she could only describe later as considered. She sat there for a moment and felt the weight of his head against her hair, and thought that if one old lopsided animal with a bad back and a tilted ear had found her worth considering, she could probably find the 41 acres worth considering in return. It was 3 weeks after this that Olena Marchuk appeared at her gate. Olena Marchuk was 78 years old and had come from a village in western Ukraine 31 years ago, with her husband who had died 12 years later and left her the 6 acres of the Marchuk place to the north, which she farmed for vegetables and kept in a state of order that the surrounding county found slightly reproachful. She was small and deliberate, and wore the same style of headscarf in all weather, and the county regarded her with a respect that was real, but also slightly afraid. The way people respect someone who has endured things they cannot imagine, and emerged from them with better posture than they started with. She appeared at Clara's gate on a Tuesday morning, carrying a jar of pickled things, and said nothing by way of greeting, except, in her careful accented English, that she had heard that Clara Valse did not shoot the donkey. Clara said she had heard correctly. Olena Marchuk studied her for a moment the way she studied her seedlings, checking for something specific, and then said the thing that Clara would carry for the rest of her time in the valley. She said, "The animal that no one values is very often doing a job that no one has thought to notice." She said it the way you say something you have known long enough that it has become simple. And then she put the jar of pickled things on the gatepost and walked back up the road. Clara stood at the gate for a long time after, looking at the back lot where the gray donkey stood in his lopsided way, with his tilted ear, angled at something only he could hear. And then she took the jar inside and ate some of the pickled things, which were excellent, and thought very carefully about what kind of job a donkey might be doing that no one had thought to notice. She started watching him that week. Not managing him, not directing him, but watching the way you watch water, to understand where it is actually going, rather than where you think it should go. She moved her small flock into the pasture adjacent to his lot, and she watched what happened. What happened was this: the donkey slept lightly and ate modestly, and spent a considerable portion of the night hours standing at the perimeter fence with his head up and his ears at full attention, the tilted one making its habitual correction toward whatever sound had come from the tree line. Harlan County had coyotes, every operation in the valley had coyotes, and losing lambs to them was simply one of the costs entered in the annual arithmetic, the way you enter rain and feed prices, a number you grimace at and continue. Clara Voss had lost no lambs. It took her 3 weeks of watching to understand why. The donkey did not merely startle at coyotes. He located them in the dark with those enormous ears, announced his awareness with a bray that could be heard across 3 fields, and then moved toward them at a trot that combined indignation and absolute physical confidence in a way that a coyote, which is primarily a calculator of risk, found unconvincing as a target. He ran them. Not dramatically, not with the performance of a guard dog requiring approval, but with the businesslike certainty of someone who has been doing this for years without anyone noticing. She thought about the previous owner's failed operation, the dispersed stock, the informal grazing arrangement with Harland Webb, whose beef operation had also been losing animals to predation for 3 seasons running. She thought about the fact that the donkey had been in that back lot alone, with no stock to guard. And she thought about what Olena Marchuk had said about jobs that no one had thought to notice. The animal that no one values is very often doing a job no one has thought to notice. She said it quietly to herself in the pasture in the early morning, and understood that she had been given along with 41 acres and a leaking shed, something that the county had been losing money to for years and had been looking for in all the wrong places. She built the flock slowly and with extraordinary care, because her arithmetic demanded she be right each time. She spent 2 months learning every reputable sheep producer within driving distance and attended 3 sales before she bid on anything, watching which animals moved with the relaxed certainty of well-managed stock, and which carried the tight wariness of animals on poor nutrition. And she bought only what she could evaluate, 4 ewes in October and 3 more in November, spending at each sale the minimum that the quality she required would cost, which was not the minimum anyone expected her to spend. By December, she had 12 sheep and the original donkey, and an operation that cost more each month than it returned, which was expected, and an operation that had lost no lambs to predation since April, which was not expected and which she had not mentioned to anyone. She was banking it, she was keeping it the way you keep a fire when wood is scarce, cold down and covered, visible to nobody, losing no heat. There was also a boy named Tomas, who was 9 years old and belonged to the Reyes family, that leased the small parcel at the valley's southern end and ran a few dozen sheep of their own in circumstances that the arithmetic could not have supported, and which depended on the father working 2 other jobs that kept him away from the animals more than was ideal. Thomas appeared at Clara's fence one Saturday in November and watched her work for 40 minutes without saying anything. And when she finally looked up and asked him what he needed, he said he was watching the donkey. She said that was fine. He said the donkey's name should be Capitan. She said she had been calling him Donkey and that Capitan was a significant improvement. He became a regular presence, Tomas Reyes, coming on weekend mornings and on weekday afternoons after school, doing work without being asked to do it, talking to the animals in a mixture of Spanish and English that seemed to produce results, learning the names of each in a flock that Clara had begun privately naming as they came to have distinct personalities she could read at a distance. It was Tomas who named the lead ewe Senora, which was correct in a way that made Clara feel she had been missing the obvious. And it was Tomas who told her, in November, with the direct reportage of a 9-year-old, that the men at the feed co-op called the Demarest place the charity case and called Clara Voss the woman alone like it was her whole name. Like it was a diagnosis. Clara said that being right was its own kind of reply, and Tomas looked at her steadily and said, "Yes, but how long does it take?" She said, "Longer than it should, usually." He seemed to find this a satisfactory answer and went back to filling the water trough. The thing that happened in February was quiet enough that she did not recognize it as the turn until she was already past it. A man came from Crestfield, 40 miles south, driving a truck with a livestock trailer, looking for what he called a reliable lambing operation that might have animals to sell. He was a buyer for a group of small specialty grocery operations in a mid-sized city she had never visited, and he was looking for animals raised without the prophylactic, chemical protocols that the large conventional operations used as a matter of scale. He had been told that Demarest Place was a failed operation. He had come anyway because someone had mentioned in passing that there was a young flock on it under new management, and he was low on options. His name was Dietrich, and he walked through her flock the way a person walks through a library, reading things. He spent 45 minutes. He watched Senora moving with the easy, loose-shouldered walk of an animal that does not carry stress in its body, and he watched the others. And he watched Capitan standing at the fence line in the February sun with the dignified patience of someone who has earned his position. He asked her what she was getting per head at the co-op auction. She told him the number, which was the standard county number, which was modest. He offered her a number that was 38% higher. She kept her face still. He said that the quality of her animals was not routine, and that the market he represented paid for quality, and that if she could maintain it, he would return in May. She said she expected she could manage that. He shook her hand and drove back to Crestfield, and she stood in the pasture for a long time afterwards doing the new arithmetic, which arrived at different conclusions than the old arithmetic, and she did not tell anyone in Harlan County what Dietrich had paid or what he had said. She put the money in the account and added the number to her evening pages on the legal pad and kept the fire cold down and covered. By March she had 20 sheep and Capitan and 30 acres in reasonable working order, and she had lost nothing to predation in 11 months, and she had one outside buyer paying a premium she had not shared with the county, and she was beginning to understand what the property could become if she continued to listen to it rather than direct it. Olena Marchuk came in March with seeds she was dividing from her own stores, and stayed for 2 hours, drinking tea and talking about soil structure and the memory of ground, the way old ground remembers what it was before it was worked too hard and will return to it if you let it rest in the right places. She said, ground is like a person who has been asked to give too much. Stop asking for a season and watch what it offers on its own. She looked at Clara's pasture rotation maps and nodded at them the way a teacher nods at work that shows real thinking. And then she said, "And your donkey is keeping the count accurate," and Clara said he was. And Olena nodded again, as though this had never been in doubt, which from her perspective it probably hadn't. April came, and with it Gerald Pruitt for the first time arriving in a company truck with Consolidated Pasture Holdings on the door in discreet lettering. He had a card and a folder and a manner that was warm in the practiced way of someone who has learned warmth as a strategy rather than a habit. He said he had heard she had taken on the Demarest place and that she was doing some interesting things with it. The word interesting had a quality she recognized immediately, the quality of a compliment aimed at someone you do not consider a serious opponent. He said that Consolidated Pasture Holdings had been consolidating several valley properties into a managed cooperative structure, and that the Demarest place would be a natural fit, given its position and given that many of the solo operators in the valley were finding the economics increasingly challenging. Which was a true statement, delivered with the practiced neutral concern of someone who has spent time making true statements sound like offers of rescue. He said he was prepared to make a fair offer for the property, which he then named. The offer was 11% above what she had paid at the foreclosure auction, which would have left her, after costs and the year of work, with nothing and no claim on anything and nowhere particular to go. She told him she was not interested. He said he understood that, of course, and that the offer was open, and he left with the unhurried ease of someone who considers an initial refusal a formality. June brought Dietrich back from Crestfield, and brought a number that was better than February's, and brought the dry feeling to the air that Old Valley residents called the held breath, the specific quality of late June air that means the rain that should be coming is making up its mind. July confirmed what June had suggested. The rain did not come. In August it became a fact too large to politely ignore, and by the third week of August the creek had pulled back to a thread, and the co-op's communal summer pasture was the color of old rope, and the families of Harlan County were learning what drought does to the arithmetic of livestock operations. It arrives the way a furnace door opens, not suddenly, but with an accumulating heat that you first tolerate, and then manage, and then simply endure, because there is no other choice, and what it does to an operation depends entirely on what your operation was doing before it arrived. If your operation was doing what the Valley's conventional wisdom said to do, which was to carry as many animals as the good years would support, then the drought found you extended and committed and short on the one thing it was taking, which was water and the grass that water makes. If your operation had been doing something the Valley's conventional wisdom had laughed at, which was to carry fewer animals on more carefully managed pasture with a rotational system that left ground fallow long enough to recover its organic depth, and if your operation sat on 41 acres that happened to include one parcel of ground where a small seep from a hillside spring fed a marshy half-acre that had always been useless for grazing but was now producing a slow, persistent green in a county going brown, then the drought found you differently. She had found the seep in her second month, stepping in it in the dark during a fence check and soaking her boot, and she had thought for weeks about what it meant and what to do with it. And she had done nothing dramatic with it, had simply stopped running animals to that corner and let it be what it was. The land had been offering all along. By August it was the green corner of a brown county, and Capitan patrolled its edges nightly, and her flock drank from the small pool she had shaped there with minimal earthwork, and the grass in her rotation pastures, rested and built up over 14 months of careful management, was thinner than in a good year, but present in a year when presence was the whole question. Gerald Pruitt came back in the second week of August. He came without the warm folder, and, with two men, she did not recognize who stood by the truck and looked at her pasture with a professional assessing quality. He said the holdings company was in a position to make a substantially improved offer given current conditions, and he named a figure. The figure was twice what she had paid. She looked at the green corner of her pasture, and at Capitan, at his post, and at Senora, moving through the sparse grass, with her characteristic loose ease, and she said she was, still, not interested. Pruitt's warmth contracted just slightly, the way a pupil contracts in sudden light, and he said that the county commission had been discussing emergency grazing allotments, and that in the event of a declared agricultural disaster, the commission had the authority to designate underutilized resources, and he said the word underutilized with a careful precision that told her he had looked at her stocking numbers and found them lower than a conventional operation of her acreage would carry. She said she understood what he was saying. He said he only wanted her to understand the landscape, by which he did not mean the actual landscape. And then he left. She stood in the pasture after and thought about underutilized, and she did the new arithmetic, and she understood that the next weeks would be a different kind of work. Harland Webb came on a Tuesday, which she had not expected, because Harland Webb had been among the first and most reliable sources of the county's settled opinion that Clara Voss was a charity case who had overpaid for a joke. He came in the mid-morning on foot from across the property line, wearing his good boots and no hat, which was a formal gesture in its own way. He stood at her gate, and she came out to meet him, and he looked at the ground for a moment before looking at her, which told her what the visit cost him. He said his well pasture was gone, his creek access was a mud flat, and he had 38 animals and nothing like enough water. He said he didn't have much to offer for the use of her seep, and he named a per-head, per-week figure that was honest given his circumstances and lower than the market would bear. She could see in the set of his jaw how the honesty had been arrived at, and she recognized it as the arithmetic of a man who is being as good as his situation allows. She looked at Harland Webb, and then at the property around her, and then back at him, and she said, "I'll take 6 animals a week in supplemental feed delivery." He blinked at this because it was labor rather than cash, and labor was something he had. She said she had no interest in taking money from a man whose well had dried up, and Harland Webb, who had called her the charity case, and the woman alone in normal-speaking voices at the co-op loading dock put his hand on the gatepost and looked at it and said, "Mrs. Voss, I was wrong about you from the start, and I am sorry for it." She said, "Your animals are welcome here, starting tomorrow." He put his hat on, which he had been holding, and walked back the way he had come, and she went inside and sat at the table with her legal pad and ran the arithmetic again, and the numbers which had been moving in her favor for 8 months were now moving in a direction she had not planned for, but felt entirely ready to meet. The meeting in the feed barn on the 3rd Thursday of August had been called by the co-op board, which had been under pressure from the county extension office to identify available resources for emergency livestock water access, and which had been provided by sources it had not independently verified. A preliminary count of the valley's operational water points. The preliminary count placed Clara Voss's seep access at a capacity significantly above what her stocking rate appeared to require. The county extension agent, who was not a dishonest man, but who had received his information from a source that turned out to be Gerald Pruitt's regional assistant, read the capacity figure aloud at the start of the meeting, and the figure was accurate, but the precision of it was a degree finer than any official survey would produce, and Clara Voss, sitting on her hay bale in the back of the barn, heard it and recognized it. She had the actual survey. She had done it herself with stakes and a measuring cord in the spring, and she had written it on a specific page of a specific yellow legal pad, and the figure the extension agent read aloud was the number on that page carried to the same decimal. And the only person outside her own farmhouse who could have come by that figure was someone who had come onto her property and made their own count without her knowledge. She sat with this knowledge for the entire first half of the meeting, while Gerald Pruitt stood near the whiteboard and talked to the gathered families about cooperative resource pooling and shared infrastructure management and the efficiency benefits of consolidated water access, all of which were real things being used to perform a function they had not been designed for, which was to establish a cooperative organization that Consolidated Pasture Holdings would naturally be positioned to administer. When Pruitt said her name in his careful, warm way and told the gathered families that Mrs. Voss had a resource they could all benefit from, and that it would take only good sense and goodwill to bring it into a properly managed collective framework, she stood up. She was not dramatic about it. She stood up, the way you stand up in a room where you have been sitting too long and your legs are ready. She said she had a question for the county extension agent. She asked him where the capacity figure he had read aloud had come from. He said it had come from the regional summary prepared for the commission meeting. She asked him if the regional summary had cited its methodology, and when he hesitated, she told him that the number he had read matched to the second decimal, a measurement she had made herself and recorded in her own notes, and that neither the county commission, nor the regional office, nor the extension service had ever sent a surveyor onto her property, and that the only entity that had sent people to look at her pasture in recent weeks without her invitation was Consolidated Pasture Holdings. She looked at Gerald Pruitt. She said, "Mr. Pruitt, I'd be grateful if you could tell us how your capacity estimate came to match a private survey that was never shared with any official body." Pruitt's warmth, which had been holding steady through considerable provocation, now did a specific thing she had seen before in men caught between the position they have prepared and the reality that has arrived instead. It did not disappear, but it reconfigured into the warmth of someone performing wellness rather than feeling it. He said the figure might have come from multiple sources, and that the important thing was the resource access question at hand. She said, "Yes, the resource access question is exactly what I'd like to address." And she turned to the families in the barn, and she said she was not interested in selling to Consolidated Pasture Holdings at any price, and that she was not interested in a managed collective framework administered by an outside corporation, and that she had built what she had built on her own 41 acres, by methods that the county had been welcome to observe for 14 months, and that the county had chosen instead to call her a charity case and a woman alone like it was her whole name. She let that settle, the way you let something settle. And then she said that she was prepared to make her water access and her winter hay reserve, which she had been building for 4 months against exactly this contingency, available to the Valley families at a price of shared labor, 3 half-days per family per month on whatever project she named, because she needed the hands and they needed the water, and that seemed to her like arithmetic that worked for everyone in the room. She said the arrangement would be contracted in writing, fairly, with the county clerk's office, and that any family present was welcome to it, and any family that preferred to work with Consolidated Pasture Holdings was of course free to make that choice. She sat back down. The barn was very quiet for a moment, and then Harland Webb, who was standing near the door with his hat in his hands again, started nodding, and a woman named Dory Fielder, who ran the largest conventional sheep operation in the valley and had been one of the reliable sources of county opinion about Clara Voss, said out loud, "I want the contract." One by one, the families in the barn said the same. Gerald Pruitt looked at his whiteboard for a moment, and then he picked up his clipboard and he left, and nobody moved to stop him or asked him to stay, and the sound of his truck starting in the gravel lot outside came through the open barn doors and diminished north up the county road, and that was the last that Harlan County's sheep farmers required of. Consolidated Pasture Holdings. Elena Marchuk was at the gate when Clara drove back in that afternoon. She was standing there with no jar and no offering, just herself, in her headscarf, in the August heat that had not relented. She looked at Clara get out of the truck and she said, "Well?" Clara said that it had gone all right. Olena said, "The animal that no one values is very often doing a job that no one has thought to notice." She said it the same way she had said it 14 months before, without emphasis, as though it were simply true and its being true was enough. Clara looked at the pasture where Capitan was making his unhurried late afternoon circuit of the fence line, and at Senora moving in that loose, easy way she always moved, and at the green corner where the seep continued to offer itself up with the quiet persistence of a thing that had always been there and had never required anyone's permission to be too useful. She said, I think it was the donkey finally that turned the thing. Alina made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but had the quality of one, and said it was always the donkey. She turned and walked back up the road, and her posture was, as it always was, entirely perfect. The rain came in the second week of September. Not all at once, but steadily, over 3 days, the way good rain comes when it is serious about the job. Tomas Reyes was there when it started, sitting in the equipment shed watching it come across the hills the way weather rolls in when it has made its decision, and he said, Capitan knows it's coming. Look at him. Capitan was standing in the pasture with both ears up, the tilted one having made one of its rare full corrections, and he was very still, in the way that animals are still when they are receiving something important. And the first drops hit the dry ground around him and made the specific smell of rain on summer-parched earth. That is one of the oldest things a human knows. And Tomas breathed it in and smiled with his whole face in the way that 9-year-olds smile when something large has resolved in favor of the world. Clara stood in the doorway of the equipment shed and watched the rain come down on her 41 acres, on the recovering pasture, and the seep corner, and the fence line she had repaired, and the flock that moved through the falling water, with the unhurried ease of animals that are exactly where they belong. And she ran the arithmetic one more time in her head, not the arithmetic of survival, which had been the only arithmetic available to her for so long that it had become a habit of mind, but a different arithmetic, the arithmetic of what a place becomes when you learn to read it rather than overwrite it, the arithmetic of a woman alone who is no longer alone, in any sense that the word can carry as an accusation, because she has the animals and the child and the old neighbor and the families who are going to show up in September to pull fence posts and move compost and learn what she has learned the hard way, which is that the ground has always been telling you what it needs, and the only question is whether you stop talking long enough to hear it. The rain came down. Capitan shook himself once thoroughly and went back to his circuit of the fence line, because the rain was good news, but the fence line was still the fence line, and his job, the job no one had thought to notice, was ongoing. The hills of Harlan County turned from the color of old rope back toward green, not all at once, but beginning the way right things begin, with the simple return of what had always been there underneath.
Ah! Je peux pas te c'est vrai, vous avez perdu le pourquoi vous avez perdu? Non, il est là. Allez-y. Il est là, le mur des émotes. Je l'avais juste pas activé. Non, je vais essayer de pas le tâcher, vraiment. Non, il est là. Alors je sais pas si vous avez remarqué, mais oh, plein de petits cœurs. J'ai changé la barre aussi, hein, de l'objectif, hein, faut pas déconner, hein. Une barre qui était remplie, ça faisait un peu tâche. C'est qui s'habille en 14 ans? C'est Jenny? Bah, ça m'étonne pas. Oh merci, merci Jenny, merci. Non, mais il est trop beau. Alors sur TikTok, on le voit bien par contre, parce que la caméra est pas la même. On voit juste ses petits yeux là, c'est mignon. Voilà, voilà. Encore un grand merci à Jenny, c'était vraiment adorable. Hem, Ce petit colis m'a remonté, le moral et m'a fait chaud au cœur. Du coup,